Let's talk about hand protection on swords. And really, is more hand protection always better protection? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, I think that my channel is unfortunately responsible partly for this attitude that I see on the internet, in YouTube comments and elsewhere in discussion forums and stuff. And that is the idea that a sword is inherently better if it has more hand protection. You know, so if we're comparing sword with sword, there's a lot of, I think there's a culture on the internet of saying, which is the bestest sword ever, which is the bestest pistol ever, which is the best kind of flying horse ever. And there's a lot of direct comparisons, and of course they're completely lacking in context, nuance and detail. And that's something that I try to bring into my videos on this channel. But before we get really into the meat of this video, I want to have a brief word from our fantastic sponsors for this video, who are Mech Arena. Mech Arena is one of the first mobile games that actually brings the feel of a PC game into your hand on your mobile phone. You've got a load of different mechs to choose and upgrade and modify and customize in any way you like, with skins and different weapons, load of different maps and different gameplay styles. But what I love about it the most is that it's a skill-based game. Because you can modify the mechs in loads of different ways, you can play to your particular style and play to your strength. You can play by yourself or you can play with your friends. Mech Arena's got an absolute ton going on this month, including Battle Pass Season 7, where you can get your hands on some amazing new skins and a bunch of new goodies as well. There's a brand new pilot coming out called Oksana, as well as some new weapons, including some high-level versions of the Voltaic RPGs. These things shock the enemy and mess up their aim. They're a bunch of fun to use. Mech Arena is totally free to download and play, either on Android or iOS. And you can get playing right now by using my link below or the QR code on screen, and you'll get gifts worth $45. We're talking about 1 millispec skin, 500 A coins and 70,000 credits to really help kickstart your game. And if you're quick, you can add me to your friends. My name's Context, and maybe we can play a few games together. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the topic of sword hilts. Now, before I get into the topic of earlier or more minimalistic, and remember they're not always earlier, you can have like a Shashka or a 1796 light cavalry saber that only has a fairly minimalistic handguard that was around at the same time as more developed ones like basket hilts and saber hilts. I want to talk a little bit about the other hilts that were around at the same time as this, and often when I'm talking about handguards on sabers or backswords, broadswords, anything like this, we often talk about how much coverage the hilt gives, the guard that is, and how much it protects the hand. But for the purposes of this video, I just want you to consider one thing. At the same time, this is a heavy cavalry sword, at the same time as this is a half basket, as quite complete guards, and obviously something like a basket hilt is a full basket and covers the sides as well. At the same time as these were around, other types of sword were very common which had slightly less hand protection. Okay, and I'm just going to grab an example right by me here, and this is the 3-bar hilt. Okay, now statistically, this type of hilt was more common in the 19th century than that type of half basket that we've just seen. And yet, you know, it has gaps through it here. It has an asymmetrical guard that projects on the side that your hand is predominantly, at least if you're a right-handed person, projects less on this side. So overall, in simplistic terms, this offers less hand protection, certainly less than a full basket and less than a half basket. Equally, if we go to something like a 1796 light cavalry saber with just a knuckle bow, or certain types of tulwar with a knuckle bow, that is less again. So if I grab, this is actually a Indonesian perang nabur. This is also 19th century. This has a hilt inspired by European swords, certainly in terms of the knuckle bow anyway. And you can see that this awesome little sword has some hand protection, but it's only a knuckle bow. Now, the knuckle bow had been around, believe it or not, since the 14th century in continuous use in Europe. And in fact, it has its ancestors. We could go back to certain types of classical world, the falcata, for example, where there is a knuckle bow also. So there is a middle ground. It's not just simply from no handguard at all to full basket hilt. We've got full basket, half basket. We've got one-sided 3-bar type hilt. It's probably the next on the order. Then there's things like side rings, swept hilts, things like that. There's knuckle bows. And then all the way through to cross hilts with one side ring in some cases, then a simple cross hilt, then something like a Viking hilt. So clearly there's a broad spectrum. So Why did not everyone go for a full basket hilt? Well, there's a number of reasons that I've covered in previous videos, so I'm not going to labour the point too heavily, but just briefly to summarise, the more hilt you have on a sword, the bigger it is, and the heavier it is, and the more difficult and expensive it is to make, okay? So let's just break those three main points down. Let's deal with the expense first. That should be obvious, okay? Quite simply, the more the complexity of the hilt, the bigger the hilt, the more time it takes to make, the more complicated it is to make, the more expensive it is to make. That being said, swords themselves are not cheap objects, so I don't regard that usually in most cultures, certainly from the medieval period onwards, as a main reason really for the fact that they didn't use complete hilts. The next one is convenience of wear. Okay, now this is a very, very major point, and if we go back to the 3-bar hilt for a second, you will notice that they have been efficient about the use of metal for the hilt. The hilt predominantly projects on the outside line because that's the line that most of your hand projects on. On the inside line, where there's only going to be a thumb if you're holding in a hammer fist or handshake grip, or if you put the thumb up, there's only been the tips of your fingers. There's not so much need. I don't want to say there's no need, but there's not so much need to project on that side, so they have less. There is another major advantage. When this sword is in its scabbard and resting at its side, it now can sit flush against your body or the horse's saddle or wherever you've attached it, and it doesn't stick into you. It's not so inconvenient, okay? Even if we go to the heavy cavalry sword here, which has a half basket hilt, you'll notice it is still asymmetrical. It projects more on one side than the other. This is to do with the second point as well that I'll mention in a minute about weight, but it's also to do with convenience of wear. And remember, and I always try to emphasize this point on my channel, swords spent most of their lives, like 99% of their lives, in their scabbards being worn. They didn't even spend huge amounts of time in the hand, and they certainly didn't spend most of their time being fought with. They spent most of their time as sidearms, that is, hanging at the side. Now on to the final point of weight. Now this is a very important point, and that's why I've listed it last in this particular video. When you add mass onto a sword, it affects how it handles, okay? Just fixate on that one point for a second. When you add more mass to a sword anywhere on it, it changes how it handles and ultimately makes it somewhat more cumbersome. Now, obviously we have questions about point of balance and how far away the mass is from the center of gravity. So quite simply, if I put a mass at the pommel end, it might make the tip move around a little bit more nimbly, but it will still increase the overall weight of mass of the sword. If I add mass at the tip, it will mean that it will hit harder, but it will make the tip less nimble and make the blade more cumbersome to use. But in addition, you have also increased the total mass of the sword. So now let's go back to the medieval sword. So I just put the parang nabur down here. I don't want that to fall down. So now we've got a contrast between these two swords here. Obviously, the half basket hilt provides more hand protection. However, the crossguard is very efficient amount of hand protection for the amount of mass. There is a lot more mass in a basket hilt or even a half basket hilt than there is in a crossguard. And yes, indeed, many of you will also be saying, well, also the crossguard's a lot more comfortable to wear. That's also true. But I just want you to fixate on this mass point for a second. The more hand protection we add, and admittedly it's around the hand, so it doesn't necessarily make the sword seem that more cumbersome in the hand, but the more mass we add to the sword in total, the more cumbersome it makes the sword. So therefore, in defensive terms, whilst you might be adding more protection to the hand, and only to the hand, it's not like that guard, I mean, by geometry it slightly protects the forearm a little bit more, but by and large it doesn't protect the rest of your body anymore, it doesn't protect your legs anymore, or your head particularly anymore. It protects basically the hand and some of the forearm. So you're adding quite a lot of percentage mass, maybe, I don't know, 20% percentage mass, 15% maybe, total mass to this weapon, purely to protect the hand and the forearm, and in doing so you make the weapon perhaps a little bit slower. So in that terms, this very efficient addition of mass of this crossguard here, actually this weapon is now a quicker and more nimbler weapon. Now, what does that mean in actual fighting? Well, firstly, it means that you can move the weapon around more quickly. Now, if you can move the weapon around more quickly, that means you can defend yourself more quickly. So indeed, the hand might be more vulnerable, but if you can move that sword up more quickly to protect the side, or to protect the head when you need to, or potentially to protect the leg, or when you slip the leg and you counter to the person's head, and that's an important point I'll get to in a second, if you can move the sword around more quickly, potentially, yes, you're robbing some protection or you're lacking some protection on your hand, but you're adding protection to the entire rest of your body because your weapon can move more quickly. That's it's a different way of thinking of defense, I think. And I think a lot of people, when they think about defense, they're used to thinking of things like shields or armor or fortifications. They think about static things like tanks, like tank armor, like adding more tank armor. But that's not how swords predominantly defend you. Swords predominantly don't defend with the hilt. Swords predominantly defend with the blade. So, if you're making the blade lighter, if you're making the sword lighter, you're essentially making the blade quicker to some degree. If you're reducing the total mass of the weapon, you're making your overall weapon slightly quicker and therefore slightly easier to defend yourself with. Now that, of course, if it's quicker to move, not only is it quicker in defense, but it's also quicker in offense. And as many of you know, offense is part of defense. Hitting the other person, wounding the other person, hitting them before they hit you, countering in a single time, for example, slipping the leg and countering to their arm or countering to their head or thrusting them through the body. Those are all things that finish the fight and defend you. So even an offense can be a defense. If your weapon is quicker because it's lighter, and therefore you succeed in the technique when if your weapon was heavier and slower you wouldn't have done, then that's increasing the sword's defensiveness. So, not to say that I'm not a great believer in saber hilts, I am, okay? However, I think sometimes we've gone too far down the track of saying, oh, hand defense is everything. Because down that line, it leads us to the full basket hilt, always, okay? If you believe that the most hand protection you can get on a sword is always the best option, then a complete basket hilt or a cup hilt with added sidebars is always going to be the end result of that line of thinking. And the simple fact is that's not always the best way to have a sword, for reasons of mass, for reasons of convenience and wear, but additionally because it adds mass to the sword, and you don't always want to add mass to a sword. Some swords are far better off remaining light, and for that reason we end up with saber hilts instead of full basket hilts, because not only does it leave you with more dexterity because you've got more possible motion of the hand and there's less conflict between the hilt and the hand, but additionally a half basket hilt, surprise, surprise, is approximately half the weight of a full basket hilt. If we go all the way down to a simple crossguard, yes, of course it offers less hand protection. However, by geometry, it offers a very good amount of hand protection for the amount of mass and metal in it. But this sword, compared to this exact same sword with a basket hilt on, is lighter and more nimble. Therefore, it's quicker to defend the entirety of my body with, and it's quicker to offend the opponent with. Something to think about. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been thought-provoking and maybe a different way at looking at the topic of hand protection on swords and how it's not a simple matter of more hand protection equals betterer. It's not that simple at all. There is always a cause and effect, and it's a very complex equation. Thanks a lot for watching. I am Matt Easton, and I will probably be next time you see me as well. Please subscribe if you haven't done already and click like on the video if you found it even remotely interesting. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.